More than a half a century after a brutal killing on Long Island, investigators say they finally identified the man responsible.
Police in Nassau County announced that DNA evidence has linked them to the man behind the 1974 murder of Barbara Waldman.
A warning to our viewers. What you are about to watch is a true story. The following program contains content that some viewers may find disturbing. Viewer discretion is strongly advised.
A 5-year-old boy steps off a school bus onto a quiet street on Long Island. It's January, 1974. The house at the end of the driveway is a 2-story colonial, the front door unlocked, because in this neighborhood, nobody locks their doors. He walks inside. He calls out for his mother. There's no answer. He climbs the stairs to the second floor, and in the next 10 seconds he sees something that will stay lodged in his memory for the rest of his life. He is going to carry this image until the day he dies, and for the next 52 years, nobody is going to be able to tell him who put it there. Subscribe now, because this case sat cold for over half a century, and the way it finally broke open, with a stunning twist about the man responsible, is one of the most emotional cold case resolutions Long Island has ever seen. Barbara Waldman was 31 years old. A graduate of New York University, a wife, and a mother of 3, Marla, Larry, and Eric, ages 7, 6, and 5. She had long blonde hair, and by every account from the people who knew her, she was warm, active, and genuinely well-liked. She volunteered with the Oceanside chapter of the Cancer Society. She lived in a well-kept colonial on Sally Lane in Oceanside, a hamlet on Long Island's South Shore, with her husband Jerry, a dentist who had spent years building a respected local practice. On paper, and in reality, the Waldmans were an ordinary, comfortable suburban family, in the kind of tight-knit community where everybody seems to know everybody else's business, which is exactly what made what happened next so disturbing. Nothing like this was supposed to happen here. Oceanside, in 1974, was the kind of place where kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on, where neighbors borrowed sugar from each other, where a burglary was rare enough to be the talk of the block for weeks. Families like the Waldmans had built their entire lives around the idea that a neighborhood like this one was safe. Barbara was known around town, not just as a dentist's wife, but as someone who showed up. She raised money for cancer research. She knew people at the school, at the market, at church functions. She was, by every measure available, exactly the kind of person a small community rallies around when something happens to her, and exactly the kind of person nobody in that community could imagine being targeted. On the morning of January 11th, 1974, it was a school day like any other. Jerry was at work. The 3 children left for their classes. The youngest, Eric, off to kindergarten. Barbara stayed home. Nothing about that morning suggested it would be the last one her children would ever spend with her alive. When Eric got off the bus that afternoon and walked into the house, he found her on the second floor. She was lying on the floor of the home wearing a nightgown and a rose-covered bathrobe. Her hands were tied behind her back with her own pantyhose. She had been strangled with her own stockings, with a pillowcase stuffed into her mouth, and she had been shot once in the head. She was 31. Her son was 5. Decades later, Eric would tell reporters that the image of finding his mother that day has never once left him, not for a single year of his life since. The Nassau County Police Department responded within the hour and opened a homicide investigation immediately. What they found troubled them from the start, because nothing about the scene matched a robbery gone wrong or a random break-in. The house had not been ransacked. Nothing appeared to be missing. There was no sign of forced entry. And when detectives went door to door on Sally Lane, asking neighbors if they had seen anyone approach the house that morning, nobody had. In a neighborhood where a stranger's car parked too long at the curb would normally draw attention, not a single person had seen anyone go in or out of that home. There was one lead. Several neighbors reported seeing a man walking near the house around the time of the murder, wearing a heavy winter coat with a fur-trimmed hood, a snorkel coat, common enough in the Northeast in the 1970s. Police worked with a sketch artist and released a composite drawing, hoping someone in the community would recognize him. The sketch ran in local papers. It circulated around the neighborhood for weeks. Detectives followed up on tips, and then, like so many leads in cases from that era, it simply went nowhere. There was no fingerprint database that could help, no security cameras on residential streets, no cell phone records, no ATM footage, none of the tools that would eventually become standard in criminal investigations decades later. Detectives in 1974 were left with witness memory, a hand-drawn sketch, and not much else. It's worth sitting with how limited investigators actually were in that moment. A man had walked away from a murder scene on a residential street in broad daylight and disappeared back into ordinary life within minutes. He didn't need to flee the state or change his name. He just needed to blend back into a neighborhood full of people who had no way of knowing his face belonged to a sketch. That single fact, that the killer could simply walk home instead of running, is part of what would make the eventual answer so difficult for the Waldman family to process decades later. What had happened to Barbara Waldman was brutally clear. She had been sexually assaulted, bound, strangled, and shot in her own bedroom on a weekday morning while her 3 children were at school. What was not clear, and what would remain unclear for the next 52 years, was who had done it. With no physical evidence pointing outward, and with 1974 investigators having no access to anything resembling DNA testing, suspicion in the community began turning inward, toward the one person closest to Barbara, her husband, Jerry. There was no arrest. There was no charge. There was never, at any point, actual evidence connecting Jerry Waldman to his wife's murder. But suspicion doesn't need evidence to spread, and in a small, tightly wound suburban community, it moves fast and lingers for decades. Marla, the oldest of the 3 children, would later describe growing up under what she called a powerful social mark of disgrace. As kids, she and her brothers heard, over and over, that people in the neighborhood believed their father might have had something to do with their mother's death. Jerry never ran from it. He didn't leave Oceanside. He didn't close his practice or start over somewhere new. He kept working. He raised his 3 children alone. And by his own children's account decades later, he became a genuinely well-liked figure in the very community that had quietly doubted him for years. There's something particularly cruel about the specific shape of that suspicion. Investigators never publicly named Jerry Waldman as a suspect. No charges were ever filed against him, and yet the rumor persisted for years, in the way rumors do in small communities, passed along at dinner tables and school pickup lines by people who likely meant no real harm, but who nonetheless helped keep a grieving widower under a cloud he never earned. Statistically, spouses are often the first people investigators look at in a domestic homicide, simply because most murders of women are committed by someone they know. But statistics don't explain away the human cost of being wrongly suspected in your own hometown, in front of your own children, for over 5 decades. Think about what that actually meant for him. He had just lost his wife to a violent murder inside their own home. He was now solely responsible for 3 young children who had all, in different ways, been traumatized by what happened to their mother. And on top of all of that grief, he had to carry the unspoken suspicion of neighbors, friends, and strangers who wondered, quietly, whether he was the one who did it. That was Jerry Waldman's life, for the rest of his life. He died without ever knowing, with certainty, who killed his wife, and without ever fully shaking the doubt that had followed him since 1974. The case went cold, though it was never forgotten. Barbara's 3 children grew up in a house that no longer had their mother in it, in a town that never stopped whispering, with a father who never got the chance to formally clear his name against an accusation nobody had ever actually made out loud. For decades, all that remained of the investigation was a sketch of a man in a coat, a case file gathering dust in a Nassau County storage room, and a family carrying a wound that refused to close. Over the years, cold case units periodically revisited the file, as departments do. Detectives would pull it out, review the old notes, check whether any new forensic technique might apply, and then, finding nothing usable, put it back. Barbara's children never let go of the hope that one day the science would finally catch up. But for a long time, there was no new lead, no tip, no confession, and no DNA technology capable of doing anything with 50-year-old evidence. Marla, Larry, and Eric grew up, built careers, started their own families, and carried the case with them the entire time, the way a person carries a stone in their pocket they never quite managed to set down. Each of them processed it differently. Some cold case families stop talking about an unsolved murder altogether because the silence is easier than the reminder. Others do the opposite, keeping the case alive within the family, checking in with detectives periodically, refusing to let a name and a file number become the entire legacy of a person they loved. Whichever way the Waldman children carried it privately, what's clear from their own words decades later is that none of them ever stopped waiting for the phone to ring. Just silence, year after year, decade after decade. That silence didn't end because of a break in the case, in the traditional sense. It ended because forensic science finally caught up to a piece of evidence that had been sitting in storage since 1974. Evidence recovered from the scene, including material connected to the sexual assault, had been carefully preserved for decades. At some point, Nassau County's cold case detectives sent that evidence out for advanced testing to a laboratory called Othram, which specializes in a process known as forensic-grade genome sequencing. It's a technique built specifically for degraded, decades-old DNA samples that traditional crime labs often can't work with. Othram's scientists were able to construct a full DNA profile from evidence that was over 50 years old, something that simply would not have been possible with the technology available in the 1970s or even the 1990s. That profile was handed off to the FBI's forensic genetic genealogy team. This is not the kind of DNA matching dramatized on television, where a sample goes into a machine and a name comes out the other end. Genetic genealogy works by comparing an unknown crime scene DNA profile against public genealogy databases, the same kind ordinary people use to research their own family trees. Investigators look for partial matches, third cousins, fourth cousins, people who share only a small fraction of DNA with the suspect, then build out entire family trees, narrowing the pool branch by branch until they can identify the one person whose age, location, and background fit every remaining piece of the puzzle. It's the same broad approach that helped identify the Golden State Killer, and it has since become one of the most powerful tools available for cases exactly like this one. It's slow, meticulous work, closer to genealogical detective work than a crime lab montage. Genealogists build out branching family trees using public records, obituaries, and census data, narrowing the pool generation by generation until only one plausible candidate remains. It can take months to go from a distant genetic match to a single confirmed name. But in August of 2024, that process produced what investigators call a light match, the first real thread connecting the decades-old crime scene evidence to an actual living family line. From there, detectives worked backward. They interviewed relatives. They cross-referenced birth records, addresses, and employment history. They traced it, in the words of Nassau County Police Commissioner Patrick Ryder, all the way back to 1974. What investigators found was almost impossible to comprehend. The man they were looking for hadn't come from out of town, and he hadn't vanished after the murder. He had lived a few blocks away from Barbara Waldman. His name was Thomas Generazio. Born February 1, 1947, he was 26 years old at the time of the murder. He worked as a sanitation worker in Oceanside, someone whose face might have been familiar enough around the neighborhood that nobody thought twice about him. He had 2 prior arrests on his record, one for assault and one for stolen property. But because DNA collection wasn't standard practice for those kinds of charges in that era, neither arrest ever connected him to Barbara's case while he was alive. Thomas Generazio died of cancer in 2004. He was 57 years old. He was never charged. He was never publicly questioned about Barbara Waldman's murder. As far as investigators can tell, he was never even considered a suspect while he was alive. He simply lived out the rest of his life in the same community, a few streets from the family, whose lives he had shattered, and died without ever facing a single consequence for what investigators now say he did to her. On March 11, 2026, Nassau County Police Commissioner Patrick Ryder stood at a press conference in Mineola, New York, alongside FBI agents and Barbara's 3 children, Marla, Larry, and Eric, the same 3 who had been 7, 6, and 5 years old when their mother was killed, and announced that the case was finally solved. Ryder described what happened inside that house in blunt terms. Generazio had committed a violent sexual assault against Barbara Waldman, then shot her in the back of the head while she lay on the floor, bound with her own stockings. He called Generazio, in his own words, an animal, for taking a mother away from her 3 children. For the Waldman siblings, the moment the case broke was overwhelming. Marla was on a family vacation at Lake of the Ozarks in Missouri, relaxing by a pool, when a Nassau County detective called her cell phone. She walked to a private corner to take it. The detective told her they had a match. She fell to her knees. At the press conference, Marla said investigators had finally been able to, in her words, identify the ghost and find the truth behind her mother's murder. She said the discovery couldn't undo the trauma of their childhood or bring their mother back, but it had given her and her brothers a sense of peace they had waited 52 years for. The black cloud of uncertainty that had followed the family for decades, she said, was finally gone. But for Marla, there was something just as important as naming her mother's killer, clearing her father's name. Standing in front of the press, more than 20 years after Jerry Waldman's own death, Marla said the words she had waited her entire adult life to say. Their father was exonerated. He was a victim in this story too, she said, not a villain. He had spent the rest of his life quietly doubted by people in his own community for a crime he never committed, and now, finally, the record could be set straight, even though he never lived to hear it himself. It was, in her words, a way of honoring her mother's memory with the full truth finally on the table. Her brother Larry spoke as well, and what he said captured something almost impossible to reconcile. He told reporters that the tragedy, as horrific as it was, had shaped him into a more present father to his own daughter and a better partner to his fiancée, because he learned as a young child exactly how quickly the people you love can be taken from you. He said the loss taught him to cherish the women in his life in a way he might not have otherwise. Still, he said, it was bittersweet, because his father went to his grave never truly knowing who was responsible or why. That gap between finally knowing and knowing too late for it to matter to the person who needed it most was something Larry said he'd been sitting with since the moment he got the call. And then there was Eric, the boy who stepped off the school bus in 1974 and found his mother on the floor of their home. Now an adult, he told reporters the image of that day has never faded and that it won't until he dies. He said, learning Generazio's identity gave him some kind of closure, but not complete closure, because his mother is still gone and what was done to her was still brutal. Still, he said, it was a great day, and he thanked the detectives who never let his mother's case disappear into a filing cabinet for good. What stands out about all 3 sibling statements that day in Mineola is that none of them spoke primarily about punishment. They couldn't. The man responsible had been dead for over 2 decades by the time anyone learned his name. There was no trial to attend, no sentencing hearing, no moment in a courtroom where the Waldman family could face the person who did this. Marla addressed that directly, telling reporters that solving her mother's murder was never really about legal consequences for a dead man. It was about something closer to emotional and psychological resolution, the ability to finally say, out loud, that their mother's death was a real, solvable crime, with a real answer, rather than a mystery their family would carry forever. It was about being able to honor Barbara's memory, with the full truth attached to it, instead of a question mark. That distinction matters more than it might sound like on the surface. A lot of true crime coverage centers on justice in the courtroom sense, verdicts, sentences, the moment a defendant is led away in handcuffs. The Waldman family never got any of that, and by the time the case was solved, they never could. What they got instead was something quieter, but arguably just as necessary, an end to not knowing, and an end to the specific, decades-long injustice of the wrong person carrying the suspicion for a crime he didn't commit. 52 years is a long time to wait for an answer. It's long enough for 3 small children to grow into adults, with children and grandchildren of their own. It's long enough for a wrongly suspected father to live out an entire life and die without ever hearing the word exonerated spoken about him in public. It's long enough for a killer to grow old in the same neighborhood as the family he destroyed, work an ordinary job, raise whatever life he built for himself, and die of natural causes without ever once being asked a single question about what he did on January 11th, 1974. And here's what still doesn't have an answer. Commissioner Ryder confirmed that Thomas Generazio was never on investigators' radar as a suspect at any point before his death in 2004. He lived and worked in the same small community as the Waldmans for decades afterward, close enough that their paths may well have crossed on an ordinary day, without anyone around them ever knowing what connected them. And when reporters asked what his motive might have been, whether he knew Barbara, whether this was random, whether there was something more calculated behind it, Ryder had no answer. He didn't say, because nobody knows. As of the case being solved, the motive behind Barbara Waldman's murder remains a mystery. Investigators now know who, they may never know why. Barbara Waldman's name is no longer attached to an open file. Her children finally know who took her from them, even if they'll never know why, and even if their father never lived long enough to hear the word he deserved to hear decades earlier. That's the strange, incomplete shape so many of these cold cases take when they finally close. Real answers, arriving decades too late to undo any of the damage, but arriving all the same. If you want to see more cases like this one, cold for decades and finally cracked open by science that didn't exist when the crime happened, subscribe and turn on notifications, because we cover cases just like Barbara's every week. And before you go, let us know in the comments, do you think Thomas Generazio acted completely alone, or is there still more to this story that 52 years and a DNA match haven't uncovered?